So let's get started. Bloody Mike Clark, he's sitting in the front row again. I'm not going to call on you, man. I know you. You'd like to raise your hand and ask a question before we even start. Would you like me to? No, thanks. But you and I will do it. You know what we're going to do. So let me introduce the panel. Carine Smith Ihenacho from Norges Bank, and Simpson, Franklin Templeton, Sandy Boss Blackrock, Rob Bauer, Professor Rob Bauer, sir, Maastricht University. What's the topic?
I think it's stewardship.
Breakfast.
Oh, it's breakfast. It's breakfast. Brexit?
How were your kickers?
Oh, they were delivered. Actually, I just had a pain au chocolat with almonds.
We were always fancy.
At Paul, because the Grand Cafe was closed, and it's very grand. So, stewardship and engagement. Well, this is a funny thing. Here's what the world looks like from a stewardship and engagement point of view. On the one hand, we have the sustainability flat earthers that I talked about the other day, and they think all these folks are trying to push this woke social agenda down the throats of companies. Their argument gets to be a little bit complicated when you read it, because on the one hand they say this is basically just a deft sleight of hand to pretend like they're acting like good people, but you know what they're really kind of doing, this is the companies, because they're forced by people like you, to kind of flim-flam and then make a lot of extra money scamming people that are their customers. On the other hand, they say, this is costing, God-fearing Americans, if you don't mind me being a little bit local, their hard-earned savings. So it's a little bit complicated, the argument from the sustainability flat earthers. The sustainability Taliban, well, they think you people are basically, in hock with the fossil fuel industry, and you're kind of basically the reason we have climate change. So it seems to me you're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place, right? You got the sustainability flat earthers and you've got the sustainability Taliban. So I sat in on Ben's panel yesterday, the plenary session panel. Superb. British accent, man.
You do a British accent.
I don't think I could do it good enough.
Give it a go. Mary Poppins.
Don't know.
Van Dyke.
I sat in on Clara Barbie's on sustainability. So posh. Oxford grad. I'm thinking, man, how am I going to top this, right? I don't have a chance. Fortunately, when I was whining to Oxford grad Anne about my plight this morning, you gave me some very useful information. If you wouldn't mind sharing that, please, with the audience.
Gentle people. Bob reminded me that there's a special protocol in July, which is that the moderator's fancy may take him any direction. And therefore, we might liven things up a little bit by allowing more participation than is normally the case. So, as our fearless and peerless American Bob, show us the way, not to be posh, but to be interesting and not so fun.
I'm the only American on this panel, that's right. So there you go. So here's what we're going to do. Each panelist gets 3 to 5 minutes to say whatever they want. I don't care what they talk about. It can be stewardship and engagement, your holiday. I know you're going on holiday. I don't really care what you talk about, to be honest. And if I get bored or after 5 minutes, I'll just cut them off and say, thank you very much, let's move on. And then the last person who talks will ask a question of any person they want to on the panel. I'm not going to ask the question. The last person that talks is going to call on someone on the panel. They're going to ask them a question. Then that person will answer it. That person can then ask the inquisitor the question back. Then the person will then call on whoever else they want on the panel. Kind of same format. You follow me on this? You got this? And then, we'll kind of see where we're at. If I still feel like it, we'll still be here. We might kind of get out of here early, find a pub that's open. Maybe we'll go till 12:30. And I'll probably just cold call people in the audience, so get ready, better pay attention. I see people sitting around on their phones, and it's a bad idea, it's a bad idea. I just might cold call you. So that's the plan. So why don't we just go left to right? And we'll start with
Okay.
you, Carine.
Thank you, Robert, and good morning, everyone. And sadly, I don't have a posh Oxford accent either. I'm from Norway. So I represent the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, sometimes referred to as NBIM or Norges, many names. So anyway, we are quite a large investor, invested globally, long-term, around 9,000 companies, probably a little less than BlackRock in around 70 countries. And yes, we really work a lot on stewardship. That's sort of what I'm responsible for. And we actually do believe it works. So I'll talk a little bit about how we work, what the challenges are, and why we do think it works, how we measure that. So basically, what do we want? Well, we work with the companies we have invested in to strengthen their governance and to also make sure they manage their risks well, and not the least key sustainable issues, such as climate risks, such as human rights, and many other key sustainable issues. We're very clear in what our expectations are. So we have published many so-called expectation documents that apply to all the companies we have invested in. It's directed towards company boards and set out how we think the company should work on these issues. So then you say, so how can we influence the companies? What's our toolbox in a way? And the main tools we have is really talking to the companies, what we call company dialogue, and also voting. In addition, we work quite a bit on standard setting, try to have views on regulations that sort of apply to a whole host of companies. You know, if you have better, what we think is a better market regulation, well, that makes many companies better. So when it comes to, I'll start a bit with voting. And we have as a goal to vote on 100% of all resolutions, so that's around 120,000 resolutions every year. And what we do see is actually that it's surprising how little any board members like to get an against vote. So when we, before the AGM, and I'm sure it's the same for Anne, same for Sadie, the phone call, or the amount of emails and calls for meeting you get is just enormous. And that's because the board wants to get your support vote. And you think, okay, we're probably maybe a 2% owner, 1% owner, some companies 3 or 5% owner, and you think, does that really matter that much? And it actually do. So what we do see is that ahead of the AGM, sometimes even with dialogue before the AGM, we do see company maybe even changing some policies, sometimes even withdrawing some resolutions, sometimes changing the way they look at a shareholder resolution because of a dialogue they have with us. And then you can say, is it just because of us? Well, maybe BlackRock has had the same dialogue. Maybe Anne has been very vocal on these issues. I don't know. But so it's hard to say if everything is due to one investor or, let's say, what the forces are behind it. But what we do see is actually many times when we have dialogues prior to voting, things change in the direction we want. In addition, of course, throughout the year, not just before the voting season, we have extensive dialogue with companies. We have it on board levels, CEO level, top management level, but also on a more sort of technical level on, let's say, for instance, climate issues, on, trying to understand better what the company is doing. And these dialogues, I mean, they are extensive. We're roughly around 3,000 meetings a year with companies. And for each dialogue we have, or when we start a certain dialogue, we try to set certain key indicators of what we want out of these dialogues. And so we can measure, do they actually mean anything, or do you just go and talk to a company just to have a chat. And what we do see when we measure sort of on an annual basis, the companies we have talked to, how have they improved compared to companies we didn't talk to? And in general, on many issues, we see that the companies we have talked to improve more. So we have this sort of way of that's, what should I say, encouraging to us that works with stewardship to see that it actually matters. But then, of course, as I always say, if you work with stewardship, you have to be very patient. I mean, things doesn't change over time. You have to nudge company, push them, and hope for change over time. Sometimes it's quick, but a lot of times you have to sort of be there as a long-term owner, and just realize that change takes time. Also, as we say, in certain markets we have more clout than in other markets. Certain sectors may be more able to push more. And for certain companies, we have better dialogues than in others. So certainly, we as a small minority owner, we always say we're not running the company. We can influence as an investor, and we try to do that in a positive way. It doesn't mean that all companies always do what we want. So I say patience. And also, in the end, we prefer to be an owner. That's where we make our money from. That's how we create value for the Norwegian people. But in the end, we may also choose to divest, which we do on a regular basis if we just think the business model is unsustainable and we're just not getting any traction after a certain amount of dialogue. So I think I'll stop here, actually. Robert, unless you want me to talk about something else. Or
So, I mean, whatever's on your mind.
Or my holidays.
Well, have you had a holiday this year?
Yeah, I haven't yet, but looking forward to it.
I don't get one this year, just to kind of share my pain with you. But look, Norwegian accents are nice, but we're at Oxford, so I'd feel a lot better hearing a kind of posh British accent. And so I'm like, look, why don't you go, right?
Hey, Bob, how's it going?
You've lived in California for a long time, I can tell. Yo, dude.
Yo.
Yo.
Okay, all right. I'm not posh. You just don't know the difference, do you?
Wow.
Which I like about you. That's all right. I think Carine set out the logic, the process, and what's involved in stewardship beautifully. You said it very well. There's no need to repeat. I would like to take on this underlying point about capitalism. So this idea that somehow the shareholder community is working to undermine capitalism itself, which is the source of jobs, investment returns, tax payments, goods, services, you name it. I want to start with that. The thing that we have to recognize in the financial system is that because owners and their servants in financial services, such as investment managers, now that I'm in the investment manager side, we are the stewards of other people's money. And at around 1980, in the US, the ownership of public companies became majority owned by what you might think of as the people's savings. In other words, not the posh end of the market. Rich people saving through, for a rainy day, but really as a sort of function of tax policy, the accumulation of savings has an intended social purpose, which is to provide retirement security for people. There's another track you might think about, which is insurance, which is providing protection to people, pooling risk and protecting people. You might also think of the financial services industry having this broader economic function, which of course is capital allocation. It's vitally important for all the goods and services and everything that we are sitting on, eating, using and relying on in our daily lives. So the purpose of the financial system needs to be better articulated in all of this work that we're doing. The financial system has a purpose, and the profitability of the corporation, I know Sophie was asking about profitability in the opening panel, but profit is a means, it's not an end. And the ultimate purpose of the financial system is to provide the growth in assets and savings for the people who are putting the money into the system. The fact now that the vast majority of the capital in capitalism comes from ordinary people's savings means we have this opportunity to start thinking about alignment. In other words, it allows us to think about what the basis of common interest is between perhaps markets where the shareholder primacy model is dominant, like the United States, and in other markets it's very different. But at the end of the day, you know, the financial system's got to do two things. It's got to be able to produce the risk-adjusted returns for the people on whose behalf we're investing, and it also has to fulfill its capital allocation role into the economy, which also has a wider benefit. So I would say the stewardship philosophy is about being a good capitalist. And without stewardship, the question is, who would we think of as the alternative source of oversight? Should it be government? I don't think that would be a very popular idea in certain quarters. Should it be the workers? Do we think regulators could take it on? I mean, all of these stakeholders and public bodies do have a role, and that's important. But those who have the fiduciary duty on behalf of the providers of capital are really the people that we're talking about having this responsibility. So that's one thing. This is a fundamental feature of an effective capital market, and we need to claim that and articulate it and not apologise. But really engage in this dialogue more deeply about what's going on with the purpose of finance. Now, because this movement landed on an acronym which doesn't make reference to finance, we sort of open this up for ourselves, right? We talk about ESG, and Dear PRI popularised this, a wonderful organisation, done marvellous, marvellous work. But the idea that this is E for environment, S for social, G for governance, all fine, but they need a lot more definition, but there's no F. So where's the F in ESG? That has been a refrain, you've heard me say it before. By talking about stewardship and sustainability without reference to finance in the basic term, you're kind of walking around with a big target on your back, which says, oh, so you don't really think about money, you don't really think about returns, somehow this must be in conflict with your fiduciary duty to produce those risk-adjusted returns. So the important thing now is that we reclaim financial returns in their own right as having this social purpose, because we're investing to fund retirement and health and insurance and mortgages, and in certain markets also education and health, saving for a rainy day. So in this reframing, you know, and I think Simon Moral Money repeated the quip, you know, RIP for ESG. And I'm not in the band of the cynics here, quite the reverse. There's something deeper that we need to acknowledge, which is that value creation is fundamental to the broader economy. It's also vital to the investors who rely upon these returns. And we need to understand that value creation, and any old-fashioned economist will tell you this on any side of the street, that money on its own doesn't produce value. You know, financial capital has to be combined with human capital. You need a workforce, you need customers, you need a supply line. The human capital is evident and obvious. And right back since the 1990s, when the idea of planetary boundaries was, you know, developed by scientists, we've started to understand that natural capital is a scarce resource that we need to factor into our economic thinking. So if we have this holistic model of financial, human, and natural capital, we're able to articulate why we pay attention to issues like workforce health and safety. We have a way to talk about why water is a risk and something that we need to track. Climate change. I mean, there are, according to science, 9 planetary boundaries, biodiversity, arable land. We can sort of map it all out. So first we have to claim finance as our own in this work and remember who we're working on behalf of. If you like, we need to put service back into financial services. Understand that we are in service to people, other people's money is what we're managing. Secondly, we need to reframe this. If it's RIP for ESG, then the question is, we need some phoenix to rise from the ashes, and I really do think it is this reframing of sustainability around 3 forms of capital. So then, the next thing, and that's my final point, really, on the stewardship front, and Carine set it out so well, how does it work? What's the benefit? I want to flag what the barriers are. It's not easy. And it's not just because investors like Norges and Blackrock and others like Franklin Templeton have very large portfolios. There's 3 things that we're still missing in some very important areas, and we've had to really, really work hard. We're not there yet. The first thing is information, and that has been a topic in this event, and we're making tremendous progress. Markets need information. I mean, for pricing, stewardship, capital allocation as well as stewardship, we need information. And on certain issues, we just simply don't have that information. I mean, and regulators are not always able to move ahead on information that investors say they want to have. I mean, I'll give you an example. Political donations. The Supreme Court in the judgment Citizens United said, well, there should be no barrier on the level of contribution that companies can make, and, First Amendment and the various legal arguments. But a little piece of the judgment gets overlooked, which says, well, shareholders need to sort this out. This is their money. It's not for the courts. That's okay. Well, actually, that's a fair point. It is shareholder funds being donated, and if we're good stewards, we're behaving like good capitalists, we should know where our money's going and be sure it's being directed for the purpose intended, which is to ensure the company's prosperity and so forth. However, the regulator in the United States is not able to rule on that disclosure because Congress has attached a rider to the budget, which says, in your spending, you cannot, put 1 penny, 1 cent into writing a disclosure rule around that. So what we've done is go door to door to companies, filing proposals, voting on proposals, say, we'd just like to know what's going on here, if you don't mind. It's rather polite. The idea that the board should have oversight, that we should have full transparency, it's just a perfectly reasonable thing to request. And what we're seeing is that proposals asking for this information are typically win a majority of support. So, well, that's very good. That's the kind of information you need. However, what about if you don't have the votes? Let's look at Meta. Let's look at the rising number of markets which are allowing multiple voting rights. In other words, it's sort of structuring a sort of skew, a misalignment on the economic interests here. Because if you don't have 1 share, 1 vote, obviously you're not in a position to actually fulfill that stewardship responsibility. And I just want to say, we take it for granted. I know this point was made about, well, why is it a big deal to have put 3 directors on the board of Exxon? Well, first of all, it's not been done before. That's terribly important. Exxon's the biggest oil company in the United States and in need of having people with some energy expertise on the board, of which there was precious little. But before that was even possible, shareholders had to win the right to be able to vote against board members. And, also there's another vote that was won at Exxon, which was to introduce this notion of proxy access, which would allow candidates to be put forward by shareholders. Now, if we didn't have one share, one vote at Exxon, if Exxon was structured like Meta, formerly known as Facebook, we would not be able to do that. So we cannot pursue that stewardship course as shareholders with companies that don't have one share, one vote. So if the hard work hadn't been done over a long period of time to win the right to have a vote on the board, we wouldn't be able to hold boards accountable. So I don't think this really is so important, and this issue about if we think capitalism should be run by the providers of capital, well, not run by, should I say, the stewardship is to be exercised, then we need the votes. We also need the information. And then the other thing, which we've all had to work very, very hard on, is being, I was going to say the victims of modern portfolio theory. That's not quite fair, because active managers like Franklin Templeton don't take, most of the portfolio is actively managed. But if you want to use diversification as a risk management tool, and many do, what it means, in simple terms, all your eggs are not in one basket, so why would you bother about any particular egg? I can lose that egg, I've got 7,000 more. The tragedy of the commons, which arises from diversification, poses a real challenge, even for very big investors, in how to collaborate without tripping over rules around groups and concert parties and so forth. And, you're all familiar with Climate Action 100+, which is now, in terms of its signatory base, close to 70 trillion. But the way we've had to set that up and organize it, such that we have shared goals, shared ambition, we have to allow each signatory to make their own decision. We cannot give them voting advice. And if we did stray in that direction, which we do not and will not, never will, we would be tripping over regulations which would make it impossible for us to operate. So the issue of how to be diversified and yet overcome the tragedy of the commons when you're dealing with a systemic risk or an issue where investors need to team up in order to move something forwards is actually really important. So the final thing I want to mention, this means that in order to be a good stewardship of capital directly in the market, be it private markets, be it private equity, Carine and I were just talking about this, what all this means for investments in private markets, and the same applies right through. And I would, point to initiatives like Novata, which is working on developing sustainability information in private equity. Also the CalPERS Carlisle initiative, the ESG, sorry about the acronym, Data Convergence Project, exactly. I mean, if these issues matter, they matter whenever, wherever, and however you allocate capital. So, I'm agnostic as to whether it's private, public markets, equity or debt. These issues of stewardship apply because it's part of our fiduciary duty. However, as, these examples demonstrate, investors also need to be able to have a role with regulators and policymakers. And I give you another example just on that, and then I'll finish, Bob. After the Rana Plaza tragedy in Bangladesh some years ago, I remember being at the Council of Institutional Investors with a number of other investors, and we were all horrified and appalled at what had happened and all the loss of life, but more so puzzled and concerned that the companies subcontracting to those facilities, which were so dangerous, and people working in such appalling conditions. The companies themselves, I think Walmart was the example of the day. So Walmart saying, oh, thank goodness, we don't use that particular garment manufacturer. However, in the rubble, amidst the carnage, Walmart labels were found. So, what's going on here? So out of this, a number of big investors formed the Human Capital Management Coalition. The idea behind this, a bit like Climate Action 100+, is, look, we've got to start thinking about the supply chain, working conditions, health and safety and really starting to build, thinking out. And somebody said yesterday, what on earth does S stand for? It can stand for anything you like, but if you think about this as human capital, you really get a very... And we wanted to build out a framework. What is it we need to know? What are we expecting boards to oversee with management? But that also led, likewise, back into the information issue. We needed a set of reporting on these issues so that we weren't simply relying on ad hoc conversations and claims and reports from individual companies to get a real picture. And the Human Capital Management Coalition has done some tremendous work on stewardship in industries with particular problems and challenges and difficulties around human capital, fast food being an example. There are other sectors as well. But the Coalition of Investors drafted a very detailed petition to the SEC saying, look, 30 years ago, the balance sheet of the S&P 500 was about 85% fixed assets, which is what US GAAP is pretty good at giving you a sense of. Now, 85% of the value on the balance sheet of the S&P 500 is intangibles. We don't actually know what's going on. And to his credit, Jay Clayton, responding to this, I was at the SEC's Investor Advisory Committee at the time, so I had sort of more of an inside view of how this was going. And I have 1 minute, thank you. I don't think I need a whole minute. I'm nearly finished.
These are Jupiter minutes.
Yeah. So, sorry, I didn't hear that, Rob.
55 seconds. If you don't need a whole minute, you can have 55 seconds.
That's all right. The point about this is that part of the stewardship responsibility is to work with regulators and policymakers to get the information, I would also argue, the voting rights that are actually necessary for you to be able to exercise stewardship. If you work within the existing arrangements, had we done so in the United States, we would never have been able to vote. Under Delaware law, you can't vote against. Under the standard provision, you don't have the right to vote on board members, or you can only vote yes. So, with that, sir.
Thank you. So you made a couple of points that are directly relevant to Sandy, I think. One is, you know, kind of who are the people whose assets are being managed? It's like ordinary folk, like me, that doesn't have any money, so it's not a lot to worry about. And you talked about fiduciary duty. And we were talking about fiduciary duty outside before we came in. So you've got, what, 9 or 10 trillion in assets?
You know, the market has changed. Now I think the latest figure is actually 8.5, because the markets have gone down by about 11% since the beginning of the year.
And so that shows up. You're also very fortunate to be getting a lot of attention from Mr. Pence and from Mr. Ramaswamy. So there you are, like in the middle of all this. What does it look like for you?
All right, well, look, I will do a brief introduction with not necessarily answering all of those questions, but I'm glad you started with asset owners who are the individuals ultimately that we are working for. These are our clients. We are an asset manager. We are not a bank with a big balance sheet. We're not an NGO, we're not a regulator. So we are working for pension funds, insurance companies, we're working for governments, corporations sometimes, but ultimately they are trying to solve long-term financial problems for their beneficiaries and their end clients. So this is buying a house, it's paying for retirement, it's opening a business, and those long-term goals last for decades. So our job is essentially to work on their behalf as an asset manager, and we're doing that with a mind toward our fiduciary duty, the long-term economic interests of those clients, and sustainability is a part of how we think about that fiduciary duty. So stewardship, I lead stewardship for Blackrock, at Blackrock Stewardship, and it sounds, it's a bit like what Norges Bank was describing in particular. Our purpose is to help our clients by serving as a link between the clients and their interests and the companies that were invested in on their behalf. So we need to advocate on behalf of the interests of our clients with those companies. But when we're doing that, it's very much with respect to the boards and the management. They are ultimately accountable, under their own duties as management to manage the company, as boards to oversee and govern the company. And our engagement and interaction with those companies is very mindful of what are our rights and obligations as an asset manager, but also what are the constraints on that. So when we are acting as a steward, we're really doing three things. One is we have a very engagement-led approach. So we are very convinced that over a multi-decade period that the interests of long-term value between our clients and these companies is actually quite aligned. And we will be, an index fund can hold a company 20 times longer on average than an active strategy. So it is a multi-year discussion. We're often talking to companies many times a year. So for example, there are 700 companies that we've had multi-year dialogue with on climate-related, more than 2,000 engagements on that subject. So this is a frequent discussion. And when we're doing that, it is with the mindset of a fiduciary understanding, in that case, climate risk, as it affects the long-term opportunities of that company. And secondly, when we are doing voting on our clients' behalf, it is, and this is of course not because we've decided to vote on behalf of our clients, but because they've explicitly authorized us to vote on their behalf, and it's a duty that we are obligated to fulfill. We are voting with that economic interest in mind. And here, very importantly, unlike some managers, we always take our own proprietary view on voting. We have our own proprietary guidelines, and Norges does as well. These are our votes. They're not proxy advisor votes. It's our vote. And then finally, we firmly believe in the importance of that engagement on policy issues like data, information. It's valuable to everyone. It helps investors make good decisions. So we are incredibly enthusiastic about the need for globally aligned sustainability standards alongside the already pretty good financial information that's available. And we recognize that that has its challenges. So the way that we do this is we actually have made a big investment in stewardship. We've got 70 people globally who do only stewardship, and that is unusual. I don't think there's any other manager who has that level. Some are beginning to build, some of the bigger ones, but we still think we've got the largest team. 17 languages, 55 markets, 3,500 engagements a year. It's a very big engagement, and this is in addition to all of our active PMs who are having their own engagements, managing their own money. And the purpose of this is so that we can have that high quality, enduring dialogue where we really do think that there's a mutual interest. It's governance first, because ultimately if you have a high quality board and they are making the right decisions about executive compensation, and they are being thoughtful about long-term strategy, they're bringing a diverse professional perspective to that company, they've got enough time to actually pay attention to that company, that then drives a good outcome. But then obviously, because material sustainability risks matter a lot to the companies that we're invested in, some of that dialogue is very much around environmental issues, it's around social impact issues. And when we're doing that, we are approaching those issues with an understanding of the world that we live in now. We're invested in the world as it is. The wonderful thing about the world that we're in is that many, many, many governments and companies are making commitments to managing down their global emissions. There's more global net zero commitments than there ever have been before. And that's fantastic. And we are also living in a world that has been absolutely rocked by not just the Ukraine war, which has terrible human devastation, but is really, really driving up what was already beginning to happen with a supply-demand disconnect in energy. But now what we're seeing, the inflationary effects, it's really, really, really a challenging and difficult time for companies, and it's really difficult for the people who are ultimately, electing political officials. So we're very clear that we've got a very focused, unchanged, long-term emphasis on sustainability, on climate change as being a critical sustainability risk, but we are also not a regulator, and we're very thoughtful about how we need to be respecting the companies' boards, the companies' management, and how they are managing through those risks. We're quite, on the one hand, encouraged by how much progress we're seeing, and we're very happy to be part of improving governance and, in many companies' cases, improving plans around how they're managing their climate risk, and many companies, how they're managing their human capital risks. This is a time when companies, I think, are ever more alive to these issues, but it is a journey. It is not perfect. It's not instantaneous. And so we need to be part of that discussion, and we think by showing up and talking time and time again to companies and using voting as appropriate, that's a good way to be a steward. So I'll leave it there.
So thank you. We've just heard from 3 women who are in important jobs in the real world. So congratulations. Then we have an academic. They don't do anything, they just study shit, right? He's a much better academic than I am. So in that regard, Professor Bauer, you've been studying these issues. Sir.
Do you actually know, Bob, that in the Netherlands, anybody can call themselves professor?
Oh.
You're not fined for, you cannot call yourself doctor, then you can go to jail, but as a professor, all of you are professors, actually.
In Germany, everybody seems to be doctor.
Just let you know.
Whatever.
Okay, did
Sir.
you also get a warm glow of these 3 stories? You know, great stories. And now the question is, do they make a dent when they engage? That's the question I ask myself. And also, how do you measure that? As an academic, I get all these data. Not enough, because if I ask BlackRock, can you give me all your milestones of all the engagements you did? And can you let me study whether they were effective, yes or no? It's probably not so easy to get them if you have stored them in the first place. So it's very difficult to learn from engagement exercises. But there is some stuff that you can do, and I'm going to tell you a bit about it. I'm trying to be short, so I stay on earth, Anne. But I think we can also have a debate later a bit further on that. So the first thing I want to put forward is why actually do these investors engage in the first place? And I think I heard it all. Financial reasons, we can make better companies, better risk-adjusted returns. Sustainability outcomes, whatever you call them, CO2 emission, intensity, human rights, the whole spectrum you can use, or a combination of the two. And what I see happening in some jurisdictions, I take my own, the Netherlands, and Europe actually, is that increasingly asset owners are interacting with their real ultimate asset owners, the pension beneficiaries that you have been talking about. These are not the boards you talk to, or the clients you have. The real owners are those people behind that. What they want. Is that a good thing? I don't know. But Europe, from August 1st onwards, I don't know whether you realize that, if you go to a bank with 50,000 euro and you say, manage my money, that bank has to ask you what your sustainability preferences are and then provide a product that is in line with those sustainability preferences. Now the question is, how do you measure that? How do you actually measure that? Of course, as a bank, what you can do is what you did all those years with risk preferences. You create a rather shitty survey, and something comes out, and you can manage that survey so that there is more risk coming out so that you make more money as a bank. You could do that. I'm not telling that banks are doing this, but you could. With sustainability, you can do it even better. You create a survey that in the end has an end result, go into private equity, high fee, good for the bank, questionable whether it is good for the person who filled in the survey. Now, I know that in some jurisdictions, it's absolutely out of the question that you ask your participants what they want. As a trustee, the last thing you do is do what your participants tell you that they want. I know that. The laws are different, so it's quite complicated. But in the Dutch context, that's not the case, first of all, or the European context. And secondly, totally different topic, but when you check how boards of pension funds make risk decisions for pension fund participants, you see that older boards, so people that are in our age, and there are a lot of those older people in those boards of pension funds, make more risk-averse decisions, irrespective of who is in that fund. So the same could happen to the Power 5 with this broad container of ESG issues. The people in that board making these decisions for all those participants may be totally offline or not in line with what those participants want. So you question yourselves, how does this relate to engagement? Well, this information feeds into the process on where to prioritize the engagement. There are 17 SDGs and 169, I think, criteria below those SDGs, and the ESG container is very big. So you have to choose, you have to prioritize, and that's what all these asset owners in the end do, and I think you even have to do that. You have to prioritize, you asset managers, because you can't do it all. So the question is, how do you get to your priorities? Is a question I already asked. That's my first thing I'm really interested in. So I developed some survey techniques to do that, and if you're interested in that, you can approach me afterwards. Second, how effective are these engagements then, after all? So it's very difficult to measure as the data is not there. What I was able to do is I approached FNC's responsible engagement overlay. Some of you will know it. Then was bought by BMO. BMO was bought by Columbia Threadneedle. It seems to be a hot potato, this service. But in the end, we were able to study 25,000 engagements on the record with 2,500 companies globally, not just in the US or Europe, but everywhere. And what do we find? So I'll give you a few bits and pieces. Number one out of 5 engagements is successful. So 4 out of 5 are not. Then you ask yourself, which of those that are successful, why are they successful? And I'm going to give you some information on that is quite straightforward, actually. First of all, if they are mappable to materiality according to SASB or MSCI, engagement are more bound to be successful. I would say companies are probably more responsive to those engagements. Therefore, they are more successful. And successful, I mean, in the ESG space, or the sustainability, or whatever term we use here, space. So not in the financial space. But these material engagements also are successful financially, both in stock market performance terms and in accounting performance terms in the period after the engagement. Just like Elroy Dimson showed in one of his papers, using part of the same data set, it continues. So there is some good news there. What I find even more interesting is that the straightforward engagement intensities also matters. And so if you are perseverant, if you just do not just send an email, but you call them and you have a Zoom meeting and you go there, and you do that for a few years, you're also bound to be more successful than if you have just one simple message, which is quite obvious, but still, we have it on paper now. Then what I find an interesting point from my other papers that I did in this space, and engagement, I would say, it's or active ownership, whatever you call it, it's not just the private space where you talk to companies, but also the public space where you file shareholder proposals. And what is even more interesting, if you combine the two, so that you have a strategy. First you might go private, and then you go public, but maybe in some circumstances the other way around. I don't know, depends on the context. I also would like to hear the views of the panel on that, actually. But what you can see is that if you file shareholder proposals, you are bound to be more successful if you have more institutional ownership in that firm. So if I have an engagement budget as an engagement activity, then I would not spend it on Walmart, because you can with filing shareholder proposals, because you will never win the vote in the first place. And you can better go somewhere else. And concentrated shareholder ownership, institutional shareholder ownership, is even better. So collaboration between shareholders makes a lot of sense. On these shareholder proposals, I want to make a point. Imagine, in the US, $2,000 and you can file a proposal. People do that, actually. So I studied all these proposals for the last 20 years on the US stock market. So if you file a proposal, it goes to the company, and the company can then decide to bring it to a vote or not. They can also go into a discussion with you. You reach a sort of an agreement, and in the end, the proposal is withdrawn. That is a sign of actual power of the investor. We show in our papers that actually the investors that are able to withdraw those proposals are the institutional investors, again, concentrated institutional ownership, and where there's collaboration going on. But it also shows that just reporting what is happening on the ballot is not really interesting, because that is a selected bias of proposals that were not negotiated, and apparently the management thought, we're going to win anyway. So that's not so interesting to look at that. So, but then again, it's not easy to get access to what's going on in those withdrawal processes. Yeah. That's very bilateral. Nonetheless, I think that's a very important thing to bear in mind. Finally, and I'm going to keep it short, so it's my final third point. When you observe that a corporate director in a firm A, for instance in an oil firm, has been experiencing a file shareholder proposal or an engagement process, then we find that if that same corporate director is a director in another firm, he takes this experience with him to that firm. So what you see is that if the environmental proposal successful in firm A is successful in firm A, that same director who works at firm B, even in different industries, you see in that firm the environmental quality of the firm going up after that proposal in firm A. So there's a spillover effect, which also means that maybe your success is bigger than you actually think, because there may be some spillover effects going on. it sounds like I end up with a great story for you, but I still think that you have a big responsibility, especially with the big words you're using in those 3 introductions, to show how effective your engagement is. So that means showing what you do, to store it, to deliver it to the public, and show how effective it is and how you can also show that you were the one involved in that as Climate Action 100 Plus group or whatever. That would be my point.
So one thing I hear, ladies and anybody else that's an asset manager, Rob needs some more data. So, I've got his email address, send it to me. I won't look at it. I'll send it to Rob. So I read this protocol about the moderator's rights very carefully before I came in, and there's a clause in there, you probably haven't looked at it lately, that it says, not only can the moderator do whatever he or she wants to do, they can change their mind. So, I laid out a format, but, now we're not going to do that. Because I'm going to do something else just because I feel like it.
Why not?
Why not, right?
Why not?
So when I was at Harvard Business School for many years, there's this thing called cold calling, which means you just call it whoever you want, whether their hands are up or not. I don't really care. There's this woman from down under who came late. Sarah Barker. And I'm like, this is like my session. And you're coming late? You're coming late? Jesus Christ. I can't believe it, but I like hearing an Australian accent because it always makes me culturally feel better about myself when I'm in the UK. So with that, Sarah, please, what's on your mind as you listen to this, even though you came in late?
Thank you. Thank you, Bob. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a corporate lawyer. I specialise in fiduciary duty and climate change. I'm also an asset owner. I'm on the board of one of the largest pension funds in Australia. Thank you so much, ladies and Rob. But particularly ladies, I was so struck looking at this session to realise that this panel is actually the 3rd largest economy in the world. If you add up the FUM on this panel, you are the 3rd largest economy in the world behind the US and China. Bob and I had breakfast this morning, which is why he's picking on me. And we were talking about the US problem. Now, I heard on the panel today, we're not regulators, we're respectful of management. I also heard the tragedy of the commons, universal owners, and the data challenge, the financial reporting problem. So my question/challenge for the 3rd largest economy in the world is, what are you doing publicly and behind the scenes to support the SEC disclosure rules? What are you doing publicly and behind the scenes to advocate to FASB to change the GAAP accounting standards? And what are you doing publicly and behind the scenes to do what is my 2022 phrase of the year, calling bullshit on the GOP, because that is in the long-term financial interests of your asset owners?
Sandy, please go.
Well, let me start with thank you for the question. Long question, complicated answer. 2 things I guess I would say. One is on the SEC disclosure rules, we have a public note which can be provided after for anyone who's interested. I think we have outlined a set of principles that we think are very important to keep in mind. We are very strong proponents of globally consistent standards aligned with TCFD. We think that it's very important and have proposed that this should be in a furnished form. It needs to have recognition of which categories of data are defensible in a US 10K context and which are not. And we're very, very interested in ensuring that we go from a reasonably growing and somewhat effective voluntary approach to a regulated approach that can withstand the test of the courts in the US And I think it's really, really important for all of us in the investment community to just understand the difference between that furnished form environment and the filed form in the 10K with its criminal liability for the CFO and the CEO. So we really do believe that there's a lot of strong quality aspirations in the SEC request, and our long form is, I believe, available as well. But have made some suggestions about where, for example, in the category of Scope 3, we think that a comply or explain with an eye toward the U.S. definition of materiality will ensure that the final regulation is going to be able to withstand. And we're actually quite concerned about the chilling effect if a final regulation were to be overturned in courts. So I'll just say that. And then I'd say, look, everyone is operating in a world where politicians are, visible and available. And I do think that our best answer as an asset manager is to very much focus on what our duty is. We are very happy to talk to regulators, politicians, both sides of the aisle, and to essentially provide information, share perspectives. One of the things that we've been doing, which I think is quite important to this debate, is going straight at the issue of concentrated power in voting by offering voting choice. So many asset managers don't yet have this capability. We think it's really important, as much as possible, to be able to devolve vote decisions to beneficial owners. Technically, the beneficial owner of most funds is still, it's a fund board on behalf of the individuals, and so there's some barriers to this, but we're really working on that, and it's something that we're spending a lot of time with on policymakers. Sometimes we're surprised that when you get into the esoterica of engagement and voting, not everyone who has an opinion has a full understanding of kind of how the system works. What are the requirements, what are the duties, what are the choices? So we're really trying to engage, share facts, share data, and really come up with solutions that are going to make asset owners and asset managers more able to protect a very, very important ownership right, which is the ability to hold management to account through the voting mechanism that has been provided to the individual owners and the institutional owners of the companies.
Let me just say one thing about your letter. So I read your letter, and I agree with where you are in Scope 3, which I know is going to make a lot of people here upset. I submitted a letter with a bunch of fancy lawyers, Leo Strine, Alan Beller, David Katz, Carmen Liu. Half of the letter is basically arguing that the SEC has got the legal authority, the regulatory authority, to even pass such a rule. And, don't kind of push Scope 3 too fast. I know there was in a Clara session yesterday someone that was very kind of irate about it. I mean, you need to be practical about what the political context is in the United States, and don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, because you want a rule that's going to survive. And if you came out with a rule, in my view, like ISSB has, which I think is an excellent rule, or FRAG, you're dead in the water. Okay, you're dead in the water, but maybe you disagree.
Answering the question as set. What have we done? So the first thing we did was write an op-ed in the Financial Times saying why the SEC is right to call for mandatory climate risk reporting, and referencing that this has been on the docket since at least 2010 at investors' request. So nothing's moving too fast, I think. Bob?
Yeah, it's good enough, 12 years.
Yeah,
that's a lot of
right.
pace.
So,
Careful
in the light of the climate emergency we are in, it's time to catch up and get the job done. And we also make the economic argument, quoting the wonderful Asilov, I believe is actually the partner of Janet Yellen, Nobel Prize-winning economist, talking about why information matters to markets. It improves cost of capital for companies, and it's vital. Asymmetry of information is a real issue. So that, in public, to your very good question. The other thing that we did with Ceres, it's an big environmental NGO in the US. I sit on the Ceres board. We did a webinar to discuss all the kinds of, complexities of how you get the job done with Gary Gensler. So, there we are. Gensler, me, for, Franklin Templeton and other investors as well. And we've also obviously written a letter. And also, I would give credit to Gensler, because before those rules came forwards, and, inspired by all the tremendous work done with Commissioner Heron-Lee, and we had, I'm not sure if she's here, but that was all referenced on yesterday's panel, really important work. I was at CalPERS at this point, just coming over, but I was part of at least 5 separate investor briefings with Gensler and the senior staff to say, how do we get this right? Now, that's on the public record, those meetings happen, but I guess to your point, these were the private discussions. So we understand the litigation and the complexity. I think these are all fair points, but investors must speak out clearly, loudly, promptly, and understand if we don't get the rules right, the market can't function. We can't call on the market to solve problems if the market hasn't got the information. And I would say the same point on carbon pricing, if we don't get the incentives aligned. So information and incentives need to be aligned, and then markets can do marvellous things. They don't have the information. I'd love us to talk about carbon pricing, but that's for another day. That's what we've done.
So I can keep cold calling, or I'm not going to call on you. Just wait your turn, man. I'll call on you. She's like a row ahead of you. She was smart. She got in the very front row. That's a good move.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for a very well-balanced perspective on stewardship. I'm Sharifa. I come from a corporate in Malaysia. I'm predominantly, my shareholder is predominantly the sovereign. First part of my statement is going to be just an observation. Second part is a question. Observation is that where I come from, voting principles, a lot of it, perhaps the more mature investors will try to make a difference. But the ones who are predominant shareholders, sovereigns, for example, may not want to call on certain things because they want to protect a certain agenda. So that's just an observation. And the second part is that I feel that voting principles are often exercised after damage has been done. So for example, in Malaysia, Blackrock voted against the reappointment of non-exec directors of a glove manufacturer who there was an outbreak of COVID at the workers' hostel, but the damage has already been done. So what do you have, what's your view on how voting principles can be made more effective? Thank you.
Did you have a question that you wanted to?
How can voting principles be made more effective and prescriptive?
Yeah, come on. Carine, over to you.
Yeah, okay. Yes, I'll give it a try. Yes, we have clear voting guidelines that we publish for everyone to see. And we need to have that to be able to sort of run this machinery of voting during the voting season, whereas we vote on thousands of resolutions every day. And we actually believe our voting principles and guidelines are effective. We believe we set out clearly when we would vote against certain directors. For instance, if we believe they haven't had the proper oversight and management of certain sustainability issues, for example, or even from the financial side, because we can't forget the F in the whole discussion here. But then you say, how can it be more effective when we vote against directive and certain things have happened? You know, it's hard for us when you are an investor, like Blackrock is in so many companies. You know, you need information to assess and also, in a way, have a view of how good these directors are to manage risk going forward. But it's not that easy when you vote on, let's say, 50,000 directors every year to know exactly the capabilities of all the directors and know exactly how they have managed certain things. We get information through dialogue, through the active managers. I'm not now speaking on behalf of Blackrock, but that's at least how we do it, but I would guess it's something similar. But that doesn't mean you can always foresee what will happen. So, of course, then it is important to take into account incidents that has happened during the year, which we will do. But because you have voted for certain directors, doesn't mean that everything will be honky-dory in that company going forward, but you use your best of abilities to assess the directors you're voting for. So I don't think that's I do believe we have very effective voting principles. They are detailed, they are public. So it's more a matter of sometimes having enough information, and sometimes just things happened that it was impossible to foresee. What we also do now is that we disclose our voting intentions 5 days before the AGM, so everyone can see how we will vote at the upcoming general meeting. In case somebody wonders, we think this is important information for several stakeholders and also for the companies. And where we vote against a resolution or a director or a shareholder proposal, we always provide an explanation. So I think it is pretty efficient, but as I said, it's not a guarantee that nothing bad will ever happen in a company just because you voted for some directors.
Sandra?
Bob, if I could add, just tactically, I think one of the key things that investors in many Asian countries, many countries in the global south need is we need annual election of all directors. The problem that you have is classified boards, and which means only every 3 years it comes up for election, and you also have a situation where most corporate governance rules have limited requirements for independence. Often it's, as much as maybe 2 or 3 independent directors on a board of 10, and that is all that's required. What we are doing on this is 2 things that are systematic. One is asking companies to designate a lead independent director, which doesn't sound crazy, but it is not typical in Asian markets. So that is one very important thing. The other thing is we've taken votes at over 1,000 companies in this last proxy season, this will come out next week, in Asia on lack of independence, where we're voting against directors because we aren't seeing the independence. So what we are seeking is the ability to engage on that topic in a more effective, systematic way, because we often have a problem and we have to wait to take a vote. Sometimes it could be 18 months before a voting item comes up.
So, ma'am, second row.
Hi, thanks so much for a really interesting discussion this morning. My name is Jessie Waxman. I'm with the Sierra Club. I want to just set the stage for the context for the question, but I promise there is a question at the end of this. So Blackrock and Sandy has explicitly mentioned that there is a governance-first approach to looking at corporate accountability. I know that Blackrock has adopted a policy that would allow them to vote against directors on climate grounds. I know Norges, I believe, has a policy they adopted last year. I'm not sure where Franklin Templeton stands. Governance is a really interesting approach here, and I'll use SCOTUS as a nice parallel example. Great governance structure, the outcomes you get very much depends on who is sitting on that bench. Same thing with corporate directors, who's on the board matters. The fact is, investors have been engaging with companies for years. They've been asking for climate alignment. The IPCC report came out 4.5 years ago at this point, making it very clear what high polluting companies need to do. And Climate Action 100 members, as well as other investors, have been engaging for years, asking companies to align with what they need to do on climate. Despite this, no company is on track to be aligned with a 1.5 degree scenario. So at least 2 of the institutions sitting up there have policies that would allow them to vote against directors, but so far the voting record has not really held these companies accountable. So when can we expect to see these institutions to consistently vote against directors at companies that are failing to take real steps to align with a 1.5 degree scenario?
Want to take this and then we'll get another question?
It's a really good question, thank you. So I want to come back to a point Carine made. We're probably 25 years too late starting this work. The saddest thing about being at COP26 is that it's not COP6, it's COP26. So the assembly of Climate Action 100 Plus itself took 2 years. Then, obviously, we had to get ourselves assembled and organized. However, we set ourselves 3 goals. The first was governance, to hold boards accountable to that point, which I think both Sandy and Carine are well positioned on that. The second thing was to set targets to net zero by said date. Thirdly, disclosure, tell us what you're up to. We have in that cohort, which represent 25% of industrial emissions globally. Like, this is China. It's the equivalent of engaging the companies on size, scale, and impact. We are close, we're in the high 90% of the initial 3 goals being met. Now, we're going to talk about this later. You make the commitment, then what happens? So we're now into that next step. So we built this benchmark with 10 pieces to it, which include short, medium, long-term emissions, CapEx alignment, the just transition, the impact on the workers, the communities, and so forth, accounting and audit. And I've just flagged a really important vote we won this season was to get audited climate risk reporting at Exxon, signed off by the auditors and integrated into the financials. I think that's the first time we've had a big... So I'm so fully with you. This is too little, too late. We've got to speed it up and get on with it. But look at the benchmark. You can... Climate Action 100 Plus is very transparent about the measures and where the companies are. But we've got a lot more to do. There is a lot of work ahead. It's tough, it's difficult. We've got to keep cracking on.
So, real quick, Sandy, Carine?
I just would note that we were public on this. We voted against hundreds of directors last year because we felt that the climate plan's targets were not yet where they should be responsibly. And I think you'll see the same kind of thing this year as well. So we have a very systematic program of engaging with 1,000 companies, and it is resulting in votes on directors.
Yeah, if I may, I think it's a very important question because in the end, these companies are run by the board, and I think for quite some years, maybe it's been somewhat overlooked, who sits on these boards and do they have the capabilities and the visions and to take the companies in the right direction. So it's a very, very good question. I would say we have stepped it up. We have, like Blackrock, a systematic approach to how we vote against the boards. Last season, we focused more on the member that was responsible for, let's say, a sustainability committee or the chair. This year, we actually have voted against the whole board if we don't think they adequately deal with climate risk, except if you've only been on the board for 18 months, we give you sort of a bit of a leeway there. But it's, of course, also a balance to try to work with the board the company has. And vote against it, and where is that balance? Not that always that easy to find, because just voting out the board doesn't solve the problem either. So I think you have to approach this in a systematic manner and try to go for the sort of boards you think is absolutely they're not going to wake up to what they need to do. But I don't think the solution either is to vote against all boards, if they haven't committed to 1.5 degree. I think it's more important to try to work with the board.
So I don't know if you're Dr. Bauer, but I know you're Professor Bauer.
I am Dr. Bauer.
Oh, you're Dr. Bauer too?
Yes, I am.
You're Dr. Professor Bauer? Wow, that's really nice.
Can I just say proxy voting advisors need to be on the hook? Because I mentioned it yesterday.
I was going to say something.
They didn't support the 4 candidates to Exxon.
You're neither a doctor nor a professor.
No worries, no worries.
You're British and you've got a nice accent.
Bothered by this lack of accountability.
Dr. Professor Bauer.
Sorry, Professor.
So I think it's an excellent question. I think the question is not just why is it not happening, what can you do about it, but I think the real question is what is impeding those asset managers, asset owners all over the globe, not just the ones here, to do what they can do? What can we do internally in those organizations, culturally, to make change happen quicker? I organized a debate with students in my university, and all employees could also participate. They are all members of the ABP pension fund, the big one that you all know. The ABP pension fund came and told the story. We engaged with oil companies and we changed the fossil fuel, etc. My students didn't accept that. They started a revolt while we had a panel like this. So they went to the stage while she was speaking. We want you to go out of it now. Of course, we tried to explain also that going out is not a solution also, so there was a nice debate. But there are things that are not being mentioned right now in this discussion that are preventing you from doing what you could do. And I think that relates to which people work in your firm, how do you draft those people, how we educate those people, how indeed you have to lobby with governments to change stuff that we have been discussing. I think that's a much bigger problem than just how to vote against a director. It's much bigger than that. And I think if we don't make that explicit, we are here in COP36 and nothing has changed. That's my point.
Just one thing I'll add to this. I mean, I think it's very interesting to kind of see the confluence and potential collaborations between the investor community and the NGO community. And I'll just leave it at that. So,
Helen.
you know, we met at breakfast, you know, but, you know, it's the first time. I'm 71. I think I remember your first name. Your last name's complicated. It's like not even an English name. So, to be honest, I really don't know who you are, but, you know, I'll call on you anyway, Tina.
Thank you very much. I'm Tina Mobraki. Hi, everyone. I'm a board director, and I don't know how many people are board directors in this room. That would be an interesting conversation to have to begin with. Yes. I also happen to very passionately advise organizations like the EBRD on governance around ESG and climate. My question to you is honing in on that accountability. What can be done better? I mean, forget accountability. Let's not make it a loaded conversation. Forget the directors. When we're going to metrics and we're asking, the world, step back for a second, the world is extremely politicized at the moment, which actually worries me, because we have a horrific risk issue at hand. I'm on the audit committee, which does the risk as well. So when you engage with your clients, what questions, what metrics do you ask about the risk work, the risk mapping that has been done as far as adaptation and climate is concerned for that company, so that you, when you walk out of that meetings, you know what? These guys have thought about it. I don't care about litigation. I don't care about, I'm sorry, and there must be lawyers in here, I don't care about liability. I care about commerciality, because you were at 9 billion, now you're 8.5. What's going to happen if you're at 6? That's not going to look nice either, right? And it's not to do with you, it's to do with all this confluence of risks that are kind of creating a whirlpool in boards right now. So my question to you is, what metrics do you walk into when you're engaging on the risk side, on the management side? Who cares about standards? I have an issue at hand here. I don't want to please the standards, I want to please the commerciality of the assets that I'm holding and the people that I'm managing. So what would you have to say to that? Thank you.
Who wants to? That's a good specific question. Do you want, Carine, do you want to, whoever, want to go?
Yeah, oh gosh, it's a complicated question. What type of, I think it's hard to boil down to one set, to be honest, and it depends what you're talking to the companies about. But if you talk about climate, I think now, we have deep discussions around climate risks and the company's exposures. And there's then a lot of metrics we look at. You have to, because in order to be a good steward, I think when it comes to climate risk, you really have to understand the company's strategy, operations, where their assets are located, not just, emissions. That's very much sort of looking backwards, right? But also the scenarios going forward, the pathways, abatement costs, etc., etc. And I think that's a whole new step up also for investors to really be able to engage deeply in those discussions and understand where the companies is going. So I think on the climate side, you can't just say one metrics. You have to really, get deeply into what the companies do and their forward-looking scenarios, as I said. But then, of course, there's also a whole of other topics we talk to companies about, where there's different metrics. But I think you can't boil a discussion with a company board down to just key metrics. You have to understand a lot more about, I think, the company's operations, the company culture, what the governance structure, how's the oversight. So I think it's more complex than just metrics, although when it comes to climate, of course, key metrics are important.
Sandy, and I'll do one more question.
Just very briefly on this, we actually think the SASB industry-specific metrics are incredibly helpful because when you see, an agriculture company, time series, how they're managing different biodiversity risks, water replenishment, the detail is extremely valuable, and what you would look for in a chemical company is different from what you would look for in an agriculture company. When it comes to climate, the most useful thing for us is scenario analysis around how that company is going to be resilient under various outcomes, temperature outcomes, and to understand the relationship between the targets and commitments that they're making, the likely pathway that they are on, and the way that they are spending money from a capital expenditure perspective in order to align it. So what you want to see is not, I have lovely targets, but this is my target, this is the business model change and capital expenditure change that will tie to achieving that outcome. And when I put my plan into a series of possible global outcomes in a scenario analysis, how will my financials look under 2.2 degrees, under 1.8, under 1.5? And that is a complicated answer, but that is how the best companies are approaching it.
So I'll do one more question. I mean, Ellen, it's like I can barely see you, especially when you're sitting down, but I saw your little hand sort of peek up over a chair back there, sort of barely. So let me call on you.
Thanks, Bob. So I'm going to ask the awkward question, and this is to Rob's point about barriers. And frankly, this is why we can't think about fund managers as being universal owners in the same way as we can asset owners. They're asset gatherers, and there are conflicts of interest, right? So isn't there a limit to what extent we can hope that Blackrock, for example, I'll just pick on Blackrock because that's kind of fun, the level of the votes against directors, for example, like, are we ever going to see proper action on this when, we're still talking about low hundreds of votes against directors on the basis of climate, whereas, it's 5,000 and some votes against directors on other issues. I mean, they're looking for business from the pension funds of these companies that are being targeted on this. And I don't want to talk about Exxon, by the way, because that was a really sexy vote and a lot of people voted for it. And then in no other such companies. But I worry about this conflict of interest thing. I think it should be part of the discussion in stewardship.
Yeah, it's definitely not something I recognize in my day-to-day business activities. And what I would say is it is incredibly important to think about the structure of the market. So we, help our clients invest in 14,000 companies and take 173,000 proposal votes every year for them. The companies that represent 90% of the emissions in our clients' portfolio, it's 1,000 companies. There's no analysis that's available to help us actually go deep into the portfolio. We have to do primary research, read all of the documents, meet with the companies in order to do disciplined climate capability review on those 1,000 companies. We would be ecstatic if, proxy advisors, third-party researchers would give us the information that we get on governance matters for the 14,000 companies that we vote on. But we're actually quite proud of the depth of the work that we're doing for those 1,000 companies. And, hundreds of companies out of 1,000, it's actually a pretty intensive program. And so we think that it's a better start than not doing what we're doing. And that, I guess, would be my response. But I think I would really emphasize that when I talk to other asset managers, those assets are our clients. We have incredibly, incredibly well-structured governance. The votes are done in a closed community of stewards. Only investors participate in that dialogue, and people in legal and, policy areas that have nothing to do with the commercial side of the business. I'm sure that that's true of every manager around the world, and I think that's something that, we should really focus on. What are managers doing? Because it's not as dark as, could be suggested.
So let's do this. It's a really important question. So we're going to go, because you're interesting. You're like an asset manager for an asset owner in its close relationship, and you've worn both hats.
Yes.
And then, doctor, professor. Bauer, I'm going to let you bring it on home. Okay? So, Carine?
Yeah, I mean, we have quite a special setup, right? I sovereign wealth fund, because as you say, we sort of asset manager, asset owner. We usually say we own by the Norwegian people, so we're 5 million owners, but we're overseen by the Ministry of Finance, but it's very much delegated. So what we do is on all investment decisions, all ownership decisions are made by us and not the Ministry of Finance. And then, of course, there's how we sort of get input from the Norwegian people, the actual owners, the 5,000, is through the Parliament. Through every year, there's a hearing in the Parliament, a white paper, etc., etc. But for us, it's we don't really have, clients, direct clients. We just have to deal with the Minister of Finance and, in the end, signals from the Parliament. So it's very different how we run the funds. So I must say, I sort of look at Sandra, I think not only as a sort of huge, even more companies to look after, probably even more markets, but also a whole host of clients to deal with that we really don't, we really don't have to do. But that's why we emphasize a lot as a fund that we're so transparent, and that's really so that all the 5 million Norwegian stakeholders can really see very clearly what we do. And as I said, good discussions every year in the Parliament on how we manage the fund.
And you've worn both hats.
I agree with Ellen. This next stage in the capital markets, capitalism, investor governance, we talk about corporate governance, investor governance. This is ancient. Who's guarding the guards? Let's go back to Juvenal. I jotted it down, Latins to finish. Quis custodia ipsos custodia. Who's guarding the guards?
That's Oxford education coming through.
No, that's my Catholic convent upbringing.
Well, it's still pretty good.
Anywho's, sauce for the goose, sauce for the gander. And obviously, true for Blackrock, true for Franklin Templeton, we're listed companies as well. So the thing about conflicts of interest, they need to be identified. They need to be acknowledged. They need to be managed, they need to be disclosed, and it needs to be a formal part of your risk management framework. But we have taken 20-ish, 25 years to get to a reasonable set of ideas and thinking about corporate governance. We are at the very beginning of thinking about investor governance. If the system rests upon our ability to act as stewards and fiduciaries, then we in turn need to be under scrutiny. So the governance agenda is just as relevant. So I like your question, Ellen, and I think this is the next project in our community.
Dr. Professor Bauer.
Fully also in agreement with Ellen, especially after the beer we drank yesterday, Ellen. I think
you guys were up pretty late.
so. The investor
I talked to her about that this morning. I'm glad I left when I did.
The investor governance issue is really important. I think you cannot say, Sandy, you have to trust we're doing a good job. You have to show that you're doing, and there is a lot of stuff happening that is not good. And we have to bring that to the surface and discuss it. And sometimes it's also complicated, You have these clients that are in this tax and oil business, and you have them. And how do you deal with engaging with these companies if you are also having them as a client? It's a tough job. You have to select, if I understood you correctly, 1,000 to 100 in the engagement. Was that correct what you said? I would like to see whether that is a random selection, or is there also something feeding into on which companies you choose?
It's very simple, and I will interject, which is it's where the carbon is. So we literally pick the most carbon intensive, and we talk to all of them, regardless of whether there is a commercial relationship. It does not factor into the discussion or the voting.
Yes, and that's what you have to show us.
Yes.
Exactly, that is what you have to show us in public statements.
100% of our engagements are public. We have who we've engaged with on what topics. It's published quarterly. And all of our votes.
Okay, that's great, but just putting something on a website is not explaining to the general public what it means and where your conflicts of interest were, or will be. That is what you have to discuss and make public, in my view. And those people that are your clients, the ultimate owners, you have to involve them in that as well. And that is a tough job. So when you say investor governance, it's not just the governance of investors, but also who's driving the choices, who's overseeing those investors, etc.
Yeah.
Like you started, you're doing this for the average people in the street that have jobs.
So listen, I'd like to be public about something since you're talking about transparency. So I live in Boston, and it's after 7 o'clock. My wife is up. And so I've been multitasking here, and I hope you don't mind, but I sent her a text, and I said, darling, I'm on a panel with the third largest country in the world. Thank you, Sarah. She wrote back, she said, sweetie, that's really nice. I hope you'll bring me something nice back from Oxford. So, I'm going to work on that over lunch. We're going to find, you can tell me where little shops are. Yeah, something like a Latin book or something like this. That'd be good. So. Listen, this was really fun. I think all of you were terrific. Let's give our panel a big hand, and I think they're helping to change the world.